My stream for just a few seconds. All right.
Alrighty,
Okay.
so we're live, I guess, and welcome everybody. This is, I suppose, day 2, 3, depends on how you look at it. If you heard the podcast at the beginning of the week, then you know this is day 3. If you joined us yesterday with Roshan, then this is day 2. So this is part of the setting priorities for 2022 series that we have going on for this week. This is actually targeted to all of you guys who are joining us on any one of our platforms right now, even if you're here within the Zoom webinar as well, the best place to be because you can ask questions directly. This is so that we can help you kind of maneuver, think about how are you going to set your people strategies as you move into 2022, and especially things you can consider in this new age of digitalization and technology. So the focus of today on this conversation is going to be a lot about digital learning. It's going to be a lot about talent recruitment. It's going to be a lot about leadership trends, especially when we're talking about, and I know people are getting now tired of this word, post-pandemic era. Well, let's just say it's been a morphed world. It's a new world we're living in. So how are we going to kind of set those strategies for this new world that we're living in? And today, I'm not going to be alone. I'm going to have a conversation with Jonathan Tanner, who is CEO, International Board and Advisory Practice Leader of MitchelLake. Hey, John.
How are you? Thank you for having me.
Great. And John's calling us all the way from Singapore. So, John, maybe before we start anything, before we start going into the conversation itself, maybe everybody may want to know you a little bit. So I kind of quickly glanced at your LinkedIn profile. I saw quite a bit of things over there. So maybe for an introduction.
I'll give you the potted history. Absolutely, a little bit of an origin story. I'm
Go ahead.
Actually from Tasmania in Australia.
Right.
I've been living here in Singapore for about 7 years. I was one of the founders of this firm in Sydney in 2001. So I've been going for 20 years in executive search. We've never worked in any other category but digital sort of ventures and transformation. So we got there early. We sent the invitations out. It took a while for people to turn up to the party, but it's been very busy in recent times, as I'm sure everyone can appreciate. We now have offices in Australia, Singapore, the US, UK and Spain. We're not a big firm, we're just distributed. So we sort of follow the sun, I guess, with talent and business opportunities, and more these are cross-border and distributed teams, and some of the themes we'll touch on today, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a new theme, isn't it? For these past 2 years, like everyone has been thinking always, I'll concentrate in the country that I'm in because I'm physically there, my physical team is there. But I think if anything, these past 2 years, it kind of showed us the borders just don't matter no more.
Well, it's absolutely right. We did some research last year, and it was obviously stimulated by the circumstances we all find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And we called it Talent Without Borders, right? And it's a themed sort of piece of research we've published. But we're finding that, people have started doing things that they're probably going to continue to do, mainly because of the circumstances. But, first reacting, then adopting, and then saying, well, what's the new normal? What are we going to continue to do as a part of this reaction that is better than we used to do? So we're kind of excited by some of that.
Yeah, I think I'll, if you don't mind, I'll reframe that a little bit as reacting, adopting, and then responding, because we saw that happen here as well, where initially it was the reaction of, okay, we just got to do something now to bide our time. Things are going to go back to normal, but then no, it didn't.
Yeah, well, sort of test and learn, and expectations changing all the time,
Exactly. So maybe tell us a little bit about MitchelLake itself. Like, what does MitchelLake do, and what does MitchelLake bring to the market?
Yeah, absolutely. We do retained search projects for companies that are usually in growth across borders or within a region. We also do corporate venture capital projects. We're finding sort of C-suite and board candidates to help sort of evolve companies through, Series A, B, C, and beyond.
Right.
Sometimes it might be a joint venture between a mature business and a venture as a service business, like a BCG or a Pilot 44 or one of those types of organizations. Or it might be a Valley or Asia VC funded or European VC funded initiative that's trying to get into new markets where we can help them enter that market. So CEOs, CTOs, chief people, chief product, leaders of functions as far down as VP. And it's very much been a global business. There's not a jurisdiction we work in where there is enough supply in that local jurisdiction across these sort of categories, right? I think I read in CB Insights, report from last quarter, there was something like 100% increase in investment in Q3, which was in the hundreds of billions of dollars of capital raised for new ventures. And I think that obviously the experience we've been through with COVID, many of the impacts have been around accelerating digital programs of work in businesses in retail and communications, and obviously ways of working and living and logistics. All of that has come at the same time. So there's something of a talent squeeze that we now have a challenge of supply as opposed to demand.
Right.
And it's very competitive for executives and leaders and specialists who, are on the right side of the impact of what's happened.
You're right. I got a curious question because I just thought of this as you're speaking. Since you mentioned about the scope of work or the borderless type of work that you're doing right now, so do you see, because I faced this in this past 2 years, especially because the interaction I'm now having is not just those who I'm used to or the culture set that I'm used to, not the leaders that I'm used to only. I'm talking to people who are in the States, in Europe, in Vietnam, in India, and each one come with their own sort of way of doing things, their own culture sets per se. And we kind of didn't have that luxury of time to sort of move ourselves towards understanding, and everyone had to like get into the pot and kind of figure it out. So how has that experience been? How has people been kind of adapting to that, and how have you been dealing with that part of it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think cultural empathy and ways of working and rituals of sales and all those types of things are different in every market we operate. I think if there's been an impact, I'll probably take that sideways a little bit and say that, there's been a more humanization of people, because I think we are living in their houses all of a sudden, right? So I think and I also think that regardless of your culture or your circumstances, the commonality of having children and animals and things in the house while you're trying to work, things don't always go well during podcasts or during sales calls or presentations or town halls. Everyone's had to adapt. And I think no one's immune from those impacts of the reality of life. I think that's, for us, it's humanized internally, but also with our clients and candidates, allowed us to probably reach a deeper level of empathy more quickly with their situation, because you can connect at that level of, this is our challenge, how's it for you? Much more quickly than you would have if it was just a regular sales call or a regular town hall. In terms of internal communications, I think we really lifted the cadence of our communications, but it kind of democratized the organization a bit by geography, because before you might have a gravitational pull against, towards a founding office, towards where certain management or the majority of the team might be. All of a sudden, everyone has kind of equal access. It's not the water cooler with the boss or this key stakeholder every day in the office that you get that extra advantage from. Everyone has access, and it's probably a little bit more, a level playing field. And I think it's a healthier thing. Personally, speaking from our organizational perspective, I think we've been better connected more equally across the organization and geographies than we were previously.
And I think it's also the reframing of mindsets as well, because I take this as from personal experience when I speak to clientele or I speak to a partner who may be at a different country or different place. What used to be, if we were physical, like you said, that whole gravitation towards where you are and how you practice things. And if you meet with somebody else from some other place or some other country, before it used to be this tendency of, okay, that's how people are over there, right? And that's how they're always going to be. And it ends there. But I think what kind of changed from experience, especially when I'm looking at those we serve as well here at Necole, is when we meet a group, which may be coming, like example from India. Now it's a case of, okay, we know they're like that, but what's the middle ground here? How can we kind of meet them halfway? How can we understand what their culture is like and what they've been through, their experiences is like, what their pain points are like, and how we can actually serve them better, and what we can sort of provide for them. And then comes that question of, okay, does that mean we here where we are is best served for that? And because the world's borderless right now, can we actually tap on somebody who is actually there, who actually understands? And that has now become like a very different type of consideration when it comes to people, the leaders, and in dealing with other people across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's opportunities and challenges that come with the increasingly connected global world that we live in.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of exciting. I think we are probably more quickly being able to activate work in new territories, because people just get straight past, oh, can you come and see us
Yeah.
tomorrow?
Yeah.
And it's more like, well, tell us what you've done, and let's talk about the problems we have to solve. And but I think that empathy with different circumstances and people, I think it comes back to trust for me. I think if you can build trust quickly, and I think before people were kind of much less comfortable with these formats for communications conferences and other things, but we're getting better at that. But as I said, I think our ability to cut through and build trust and empathize with local ways of working, local ways of doing and communicating is better. It's still imperfect, right? Like I think ultimately it's ideal if you can spend good time with someone on the ground, really understanding their context, because I don't think, you walk outside of your home office and the world could look completely different.
Exactly.
The person on the other side of the world, and I think jurisdictionally we've had very different experiences with work contexts and home contexts by the US and Europe versus Asia and Oceania over the last, excuse the thunderstorm.
You were just saying, like, working from home, you're going to hear all these things.
Here at the moment, you would not go outside with a piece of metal. So that's something to know about Singapore right now. But no, it's one of those things where I think we're much more fluid across borders, and hopefully I think people are more understanding of people's circumstances and contexts.
Right. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit, and now we're going to go towards digital products, digital business. And there's this saying that keeps on getting repeated by itself: if you are a digital product or a business, why do you need somewhere physical, right? Why need to be somewhere physical in the first place? We were just talking about this a little bit before we got on the show as well. So most businesses, I like to think most businesses, if it allows it, especially digital businesses, they kind of pretty much adopted remote working already. But I think there's still that human pull to come back in person, even if you have a digital business. And especially if the leadership group is a bit more, I hesitate to say this, but the leadership group is a little bit more older. It's something that they're used to. So they tend to want to go back in that direction. They tend to want to get their employees to come back to work, come back to the desk. But is it really necessary? Especially if you're a digital business, is it really necessary to come back to the desk? Or have we moved to a point right now, especially in this past 2 years, that it is actually pretty easy to just not have that physical desk, and you can actually work remotely completely? What's your take on that?
I think it's really interesting. I think it's probably going to end up in a hybrid outcome. Right. I think there are, as you say, some companies are very comfortable, just they're already naturally have been distributed, working in a flexible or semi-remote way, even prior to COVID. Some are completely flummoxed by it, or haven't seen this before, and are less comfortable, with maintaining a completely distributed or remote workforce. I think the reality is that there's going to be a requirement. This thunder is getting crazy. There's going to be a requirement to do a little bit of both. And I think it doesn't work for every context, right? I think at the heart of it, you do need to build trust and understanding and relationships and spend time together as a team. If you can, I think that is optimal. But then do you need to do that every day in an office, like a more formal office environment? I'd question that. And then I think, what we will see in the future is probably, and we're seeing this with major corporates in Singapore, international, multinational companies who've gone from 5 sort of levels of a 5-star building that are costing them millions and millions of dollars per level per year, consolidating from 5 to 2 and making it more experiential. So it is more team-based, more a place to get together and do workshops, get clients in, spend time, sort of, quality time, instead of time at a computer. Because being around, a group of people looking at their computers is not really a bonding experience necessarily. It does give you access in a different way, which can be positive and negative, to turn to the person next to you and ask them a question, float an idea. Sometimes that's really positive. Sometimes it's disruptive. So it's kind of, it edges both ways. And we're hearing different stories from, obviously, larger tech companies going, we're happy to go significantly remote. Sometimes their motivations are pure. Sometimes their motivations are, we can cut a lot of costs out of our operating model. I think ultimately we're going to float somewhere between those things, but every company has got to find its new normal. And I think, for us, we're already a fairly distributed team. We're across sort of 5 countries, 6 countries, and we've been fairly decentralized for a while. Ironically, we work with, very high growth, high funded startups in crypto and blockchain and those types of organizations that may have raised, hundreds of millions of dollars. Ironically, they want to centralize their organization as much as they can for as long as they can. Sometimes that's good to build the DNA as you're building a new company, and then hopefully that DNA starts to float out to other locations, and that seeds the core culture of your company, and in that way you're able to maintain values and culture. And I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, and I agree with you with the whole hybrid thing, but I think one thing that is important is understanding maybe or learning the skill sets that will help you do that, and also being intentional about it as well. I take this example where we were just discussing that the Necole team, we just started going back to the office as well, but we were not, and exactly like you said, we're not going back to the office every day, and we're only going back to the office once a week, and the rest of it we're working remotely. But then what started happening is we got more intentional with what we're doing when we go back to the office. So like you said, we take that day when we go back to office to do those kind of very collaborative work, because if you're there in front of the person, it's very easy to have a discussion. It's easy to ask questions. It's easy to kind of bounce off ideas, use a board. I mean, as much as technology is great these days, I think there's still a challenge of having a few people on screen and kind of trying to use a Wacom pen to kind of draw things instead of a whiteboard and just drawing things and quickly discussing. So I think that being intentional with what you do during that time when you go in is good, but also there's the benefit of not going in and staying at home and working from home, because you get to just focus on like high intensity work.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of time spent on commutes and things that it can be wasted time or stressful time. Some people, I don't know if you've ever spent time in the Bay Area, but the travel from north to south of the Bay around San Francisco, some people were commuting for an hour and a half each direction.
Oh, wow.
Either on public transport or caught in traffic.
Right.
You can be productive during that time, but it's a big chunk of your day and it's an impact on your life. And if you could do that less often, is that a positive impact on your family life and your general happiness and your productivity? I found that I was able to be very productive fairly quickly, albeit we had to carve out spaces in the house and all those types of things. But I found that not going from meeting to meeting by car or taxi or transport meant that I was probably getting an extra couple of hours a day at least in productivity. You can tend to overwork. So I think the other thing is you don't switch off because you're always in your office in some way or close to it. And the temptation is to, you can take the 6 a.m. call and then the midnight call in New York. And that's something you kind of got to self-moderate a little bit, or you could burn out.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's one thing that I experience as well, where I think now I've come to the point that I'm going to set that I am in totality in a day, I'm only going to work X number of hours. They can be split across the day, but that's the amount of hours I work. The rest is actually my own time per se. Now we were talking about work, like people working in offices and so on and so forth. But what about situations with clientele in this case? Because previously we'd go visit the client. Previously we'd attend exhibitions where they are there, because that creates a connection, that creates that collaboration that could potentially happen. It's changing to virtual events. I've attended a few, but it's kind of odd. Those kind of virtual events are a little bit odd to kind of get that connection going. I think it's creating this communication challenge or this networking challenge that we have here. So right now, what are ways that we can kind of adapt to this? The kind of challenges that we're facing right now with meeting clients, how can we adapt to it in this kind of environment, this hybrid environment that we're going to go into?
I think that's an ongoing challenge. I think we're winning new clients all the time, but most of it is through referral partners and channels and people who know us. So it's almost like a handoff of trust or a validation that comes from someone else. I think that's always an element of doing new business. So I was trying to avoid that lightning strike. No, in terms of, I think that it's always a challenge whether you're under constraints of location, whether you can go visit people or not. How do you effectively build or originate business and then get closer to the customer and the client and do that work effectively? I think that is difficult. I think it is, you need some capability on the ground. I think going back to the sort of ways of working globally and the distribution of opportunities and challenges is that, all organizations, as a digital business, you can probably keep a lot of your core product engineering function in one place or distributed across many places. But you probably do need teams, if you can, closer to your customers for when things go wrong. Depending on what you're actually producing, even if you're an online marketplace business, you do need to look at the supply and demand channels and how you engage locally and deal with problems and complaints or issues, how you provide better service and take feedback and reintegrate that at a local level as opposed to just the global level. People are getting better at doing that all the time. I think there's AI and machine learning and sort of, we're seeing that sort of real-time experimentation improve experience remotely. But I think it depends on the model of your business and where it's
right. Something you said that which stuck out at me because I could be wrong, but I would say previously before we kind of got pushed into digitizing this quickly, we would structure our resources, our human resources, centrally at one place where we can bring all of them together and monitor all of them per se, because we thought that we needed them to be physically there so that we can interact with all the different teams. But I think you said it really, really nicely that in this past few years, it's now moved towards how can we set the team nearer to our customers instead, or nearer to our clientele instead, because we can now connect. And I think there lies in the key, where if we keep on focusing on what we can't do or what we can't do anymore, then we're always going to think of what we're missing. But if we think of what more could we now do, like example, attending virtual events or virtual networking events. Previously, if an event is happening in Dubai, you got to fly yourself there, you got to land there, you got to go through that whole process. It's cost heavy and time heavy as well. Now you can sit down wherever you are and just turn on and you're there. And you still have an opportunity to connect with people and you don't spend the cost, you don't spend the time. I think there lies in that reframing that will help you do that.
Look, it's much more accessible. Like you can be in an event anywhere in the world at any time if you choose to be so. You can consume content and services in the same way from anywhere, anytime. And we've seen different models and versions of that. But I think it's almost, when you look at human resources and people and culture at the moment, HR business partners or business partners tend to be, I think, forever and a day, even when you talk about physical presence, there was kind of always a bias to head office, right? Most of the infrastructure and the people will be in one place, and it'd be sort of a little bit token in some other regions, and they're underserved. And I think that wasn't necessarily a healthy thing. I think what has been healthy is, you know what, we need an ambassador or an agent or a representative of the firm in a hub spoke way that's more meaningful at a localized real basis, but we can still run this whole thing much more efficiently with flexible and remote tools and work and communications. But it's sort of balancing those two things, I think.
Right. So now, since we've kind of given a context to this whole conversation, and you've already mentioned a few things which are sort of skill sets, traits that people should start thinking about, whether it's reframing, intentionality, communication, empathy. So we're going to move a little bit to how you can start actually developing this within your organization. And I think pandemic or not, we are moving. This was happening even before the pandemic started. It just got accelerated because of that. We are moving to a more digital driven life, whether it's learning or in equal measure, adapting to what learners want or what you need at that point in time when you're faced with that challenge in your organization. So in your mind, what are, let's say, digital learning, development, engagement trends that you've experienced and you kind of see coming within organization? And perhaps maybe as you face these different challenges, what were the solutions that were out there that were being developed that you kind of tapped on and kind of went at for?
Yeah, we work with that market a little bit as well. We sort of work with global consulting firms who are trying to productize some of their services around learning and development, or use third-party platforms, integrate them for macro client solution, training initiatives or development initiatives. Some of that's been driven at a macro level globally by what's the impact of AI over the next sort of 4 or 5 years. And I know someone asked a question about AI and HR. early in the session, which we'll sort of come back to later. But the impact of AI on talent everywhere is going to be that many roles change or are automated at a tactical level. What does that mean for reskilling? And are we going to be able to reskill fast enough in the way we typically train and reskill, or is it going to be very disruptive? And the reality is that we're going to need tools and platforms to help make these transitions more quickly. We've seen and we've used, our clients have used, there are things like, content, self-service learning. We've worked with Masterclass. There are companies like Go One. There are companies, like the Growth Academy. And we're seeing different versions of experiential one-on-one training that is starting to take off. We actually employ that ourselves. Group sessions for specialized learning format, and then self-serve content, which might be all you can eat, go to this session that's tailored as a masterclass, or go to this macro event where there's, Jim Collins or Simon Sinek are doing a 7,000 person online experience, which is slightly, interactive, but it's more a broadcast, but there is a feeling of connectivity to that. So I think people are sort of experimenting at the moment. I'm not sure that everyone's, got a really locked down model for learning and development. Yes, I think that there's a lot of development of technology and programs of work at the moment that we'll probably see some interesting outcomes from over the next 12 to 18 months, I suspect.
Right. And maybe we'll go to that question. And this was a question asked by Eva. So the question is about AI. AI seems to have gained huge popularity in recent years. And sometimes it's just a buzzword being used, but there is a reason for that buzzword being used. But it's now gained popularity with the HR fraternity, especially. And there's, as you said, it adds value to talent management. So in your mind or in your experience, how did exactly AI kind of play a role in career planning?
Yeah, career planning. I think it's probably more what's the impact of AI on careers. So if I'm planning my career, it's probably too late for me to do much planning, but it's probably just happening to me regardless. But I think if I was planning or advising someone coming into the workforce or changing roles or going to a new market, I'll be thinking the role that AI plays is a disruptive one at certain parts of the market. So if it's something that's automated or can be automated, it's a process-driven role, or it's a role that's built around rules and governance and compliance, there's a fair chance that AI will start, machine learning will start impacting on that sector at some level. And that covers a lot of ground. I don't want to call out any industries unfairly, but there are some that are probably more obvious than others. It usually starts at the bottom of an industry and works its way up over time. I think when we look at HR and recruitment and those types of things, we see probably automation and support of functions that are fairly tactical. So getting through greater sort of numbers of resumes or greater profile numbers, or ingesting content and categorizing it more effectively. I still don't think it solves the problem of engagement. So if you're talking about that in a recruitment context, it can save some of the heavy lifting and maybe surface some research and things, but will people care anymore because you've used a machine to get to them or less? Or, you still have to be personal and find a way to create a connection with someone. So, it's interesting. I think AI has an impact. It sort of creeps from the bottom up in any industry. It will probably impact every industry at some point. Hopefully, I think the adaptations we're seeing are, and we're seeing that in sort of autonomous robots for security and asset management, for example, at the moment. And we're actually part of a consortium bringing those into region in Australia and applying that to manpower security businesses. Interestingly, in Australia at the moment, because of the closed borders, and this is true of many countries, the flow of talent, students, backpackers, other people, itinerant workers, casual work staff, has really dropped away, and it's creating huge stress for many industries because there's a million people missing from the ecosystem. So in that case, automation might actually work alongside people with sensors and things like that to automate some of the more tactical or menial challenges that some industries have to undertake, or dangerous things. So I'd be planning to work with AI and expect that it's going to be an asset to me at some point. It's just a matter of what level.
Right. And I agree with that statement that you said about it doing the more menial heavy lifting stuff before you go in with the engagement component of it. I think that's really true, because this is something we experience on a day-to-day. We are a learning and development solution. So one of the things that has really opened the door for us, because through AI and through the solution that we have, someone, whatever job or function they may have, could come into the system, and they could immediately say that, or input that, I am of this function, what do I need? And what the AI then does is does the suggestions for them. And that's already lifting that whole work from a HR person having to sit down and kind of write down a framework for this person, this function per se, versus an AI who's going to look across whatever databases that it's got access to and say, look, this is what you need when it comes to skill sets that you need to build, traits that you need to have. You can assess yourself, the AI help you do that. And then it kind of immediately suggests to you, okay, these are things that you should start learning, and this is what you should start engaging yourself on, and go and have that human contact where you want to go and have that face-to-face classes, coaching, those kind of things. So it kind of takes away that need for someone to sit there and think about, how do I plan learning development for somebody of this function? Because AI now has access to the world's data. It's dependent on where they're going to get the data set from, right? And another one that you mentioned there was about recruitment as well. Last week, I had a whole week of talking to people about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one thing that came up was a conversation about how AI now reduces the biases, because it's now taking a whole pool of people in whichever region, in whichever system, kind of looking at, okay, who's the best fit, and then suggesting that to the person. So you don't need the person sitting down there and going through resumes.
I'm a little bit more cautious on AI in that situation, in the sense that you've got to make sure that you're feeding it the right information so that you're not embedding a bias,
right,
and automating a bias, so that the AI is learning the right things from the right sources to be the best, most effective outcome, efficacious outcome in terms of diversity and everything else. But I think the context that we're seeing, so I think we've seen a lot of this technology applied to Web 2.0 context, most of which have been advertising, marketing, content. How do we target people differently? And I think it's finally lifting into more useful context. I think we've all been targeted probably enough, and we've probably seen some of how automation can go wrong in that sense. So, retargeting consistently the same messaging from the same advertisers, even after you purchase something, can be a bit frustrating. But I think the potential is, like Affinity AI, for example, out of the US market, they do human pairing. So it's a really large scale machine which actually learns through being integrated with inbound customer channels over time, which person is best placed to engage with the person who's making the inquiry, based on learning over time around cohorts of people, around their circumstances, around their relationship with the organization, the nature of their questions and content. I think AI becomes really good, but it takes a while to get there. And you've got to make sure that you're not probably automating bad behaviors or expectations or assumptions into that platform.
Exactly. I love that you said that, because that was exactly my question to the person who told me about this. I was like, how do you know? And I think transparency or trust is the issue here, because if you know something is deciding on its own, how do you know it has been programmed, or the algorithm, or what input it has been taking is the right input in the first place? How do you inform others that you can trust this thing in the first place, right? This is where then I think technologies like consensus AI is coming into play, where you don't have one AI per se, you have multiples of it kind of giving inputs and then doing a consensus towards that. That's a whole different technology conversation here, but here's my next question for you. So many organizations right now, I think this is not it's something that's driven by this whole pandemic, but I think many have now realized, and because they do have HR management systems that they're adopting learning management systems or learning experience platforms into it, they've kind of realized that digital learning does help. It does help drive talent development and growth. But I think the problem is every time you put a system in place, there's that need to want to quantify. Because if you say it's a human thing, then you say, okay, I can't quantify what they're getting from that lesson in that class. But if it's something that is on a system, you want to quantify it. You want to talk about ROIs. You want to be tracking the employee's job performance against the right metrics to show that that training ROI is coming out, a development ROI is coming out. So what would you think is the best way for HRs or organizations to approach this? Like, how do they think about, okay, I'm going to spend money. I'm going to spend money implementing this. I'm going to spend money putting this in because I know in the long term it will help. But how do I justify the return of investment for it against maybe my business strategy per se?
Yeah, I think do some test and learn first. I think that a lot of organizations and individuals have platform fatigue. There are many point solutions that exist within organizations and in work contexts and in personal life that you need to navigate. And I think first you want to make sure that the utility makes sense. The reason that you're doing it makes sense. Then probably test it with a smaller group and see what the engagement's like. Because ultimately, if your teams and people don't engage with it, you get no useful data from it. No learning from it. I think some of that is just about experimentation. The other thing is to make sure they're interoperable. I see a lot of point solutions that are, more and more things are open API or plug into other platforms, particularly in HRMS, L&D and other platforms. It's not there yet though, so you're still a fair bit of curation to happen in between, plugging what in. Like some companies have invested a lot in large monolithic platforms. So, that's baked in. So if you're a venture or a player in that space, you've got to plug into those networks and I think add the utility layer. But to me, it starts with engagement. So if it's engaging, some useful data will come from it because your team are responding to it. They're seeing value in it, or it's not disrupting their way of working or doing things. I think there's a lot of personalization opportunity now with learning. And I think that's probably when we're talking about that learning evolution that is going on in technology at the moment around the L&D space, it starts with things like assessment. So how do your assessment tools sort of help identify gaps for people? And part of that might be self-assessment, like I would like to know more about this, or my role is demanding this of me. I don't feel comfortable in that element of leadership or that particular domain where I'm not an expert. But, maybe I could have something tailored to me. And maybe that's a mix of, self-service content, live coaching, greater sort of more engaging event space online or wherever it might be. So I think it's about making sure the data is measurable. So interoperable between platforms, that there's some sort of measurable impact in some way, that people like it, that they're using it. Hopefully that their general productivity is increasing. I mean, it's interesting when we first saw platforms like Yammer come to market many years ago. I know of a big firm that were using it probably more aggressively than most early days in the region here. And they realized that it was yielding, they were making decisions on people's careers, for example, on, that person doesn't seem that productive. But then they realized they're a node to the entire organization. They're passing information on, they're adding productivity in a greasing the wheels of the organization in a very different way than they were previously being measured. So we know that there are great opportunities out there to identify people who might be really making contributions in ways that aren't obvious with more generic KPI metrics or KRIs.
So I think one thing that you mentioned there is a suggestion that on top of just systems, and we'll come back to that in a short while, but on top of just looking at systems, you got to also look at how you're measuring things as well and evolve that measurement that you have. Because that example that you gave was great, where if you measured someone on previous sort of KPI metrics based on, okay, you have this job function, these are all your deliverables, this is what you got to deliver, this is your score per se, but you're kind of missing out the strength in the role that person really plays. So this also means that you got to adopt or adapt your measuring methods to actually fit how you're going to use all these different tools that you have in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, some people might be limited in what they're able to produce at work because of access to tools or resources, or they might be understaffed or underfunded. They may not have been trained appropriately or onboarded appropriately in the first place. There are many things it could be, but you might only be measuring 8 KRAs or KPIs that are more commercially biased, usually. So you're not uncovering that in every case. So I think personalizations first seek to understand, and I think that's part of what type of assessments you use to make a plan around how you get from current state to future state for individuals, teams, and organizations.
And I think that that word you used just now, I think I don't want to name names of companies, but most are drawn to this monolithic systems which have all these other add-ons that you can put in, and then you get this whole big system that you use. But I think each company which started, they were good at something. Each system that you bring into a company is good at one thing. And that's what their call to fame was. And because business opportunity was there, they kind of started building all these other components, but it may not be great. So I would say this is an advice to everybody as well, where if you're looking at different systems, different platforms for different parts of your employee life cycle, per se, from say recruitment all the way to managing, go to the ones that would allow you to maximize the ability of it. But the concern or the reason why you wanted the monolithic one in the first place is because you want it integrated. You want to be able to ease your life where I don't need to go to 5 systems to get the data I need. I just go to one and I get everything I need. So don't shy away from systems that may be available that are good at what they do, but look at if they can be integrated together with your main system itself. That just eases your business flow, that just eases your data gathering as well, and understanding all the different components that come in. So I think that is pretty strong and pretty important right there. We've got a question here, and I think that will lead nicely to other questions that I have coming here. And this is actually from Divya, right? So she's asking this: what are top 3 skills that you see to succeed in this post-pandemic business world? Okay, let me reframe that question a little bit. Instead of saying post-pandemic, let's just say in this new world that we're in this new world that we're in.
Hopefully that's where we're at. Right? Yeah, no, but really good question. I think to isolate a top 3 is difficult. I think if anything's been exposed over the last 18 months, it's probably you've got to be good at communicating, communicating to groups, the written communication, like all these things, because your ability to interact has been limited or changed or curtailed. You might be now communicating with a much broader cultural set of people by geography, by industry, by whatever it might be that you're doing. So you've got to be compelling, and you've kind of got to get the best out of the opportunities, these moments to connect and communicate, often back to back, and you run through quite a few every day. So making sure you're getting value out of that and giving value back. I think, other skills, I would think flexibility, to be honest, to be able to react quickly. I think if anything, we noticed that organizations that had a plan, like your teams want to know that you've got a plan, right? So, it doesn't matter if you have to change it, but it's not like this is a disaster or this has happened and we've got to deal with it. Okay, this is what we're going to do. And again, communicate that really clearly. And I think that gives your teams confidence that it's okay. We feel safe here. There's a plan. We'll get through this. We'll bind together. So I think that communication and leadership, having a plan, resilience, I think they're all probably things that are about the modern workplace, even before the pandemic. It was starting to emerge. It's sort of use tools, use data and information, generate insights, collaborate and partner. So ability to collaborate and team, work with partners internally and externally to solve problems, because organizations can't do everything themselves. And it's always going to be a balance between that econometric, what do we build, what do we borrow, what do we buy, and a mix of those elements for every organization. Some bias more one way or the other. But, top 3 skills, really difficult. I'd probably, I'd say be comfortable with ambiguity, be a great communicator, and be a great collaborator. They'd be the things that I would focus on.
Right. So these seems like everlasting skills, right? It's just application in different contexts, but they've always been there.
Well, they're absolutely. And I think more and more automating things or using technology to do some of the more tactical, functional things in the world. And even the evolution of that technology, like AI or blockchain or other things, will lead us to a point where we get to less but very certain truths, right? So it's sort of like some things will always be valuable. Your ability to engage with people, understand and empathize with people, to generate ideas and creativity, and then to put that into practice, whether that's with teams, people, or technology.
I've got a question which is not on our list right now, but it just came to me because as you were talking about that, I'm just projecting into the future a little bit, because these kind of skill sets are everlasting. We kind of need them in different contexts. But how far into the future should anybody or any organization kind of project itself towards? Because I think one of the things we saw in this past 2 years was those who kind of saw this coming maybe 3 years or 5 years ago are better prepared. But at the same time, how far into the future do you look? Because there's so many question marks about things. Like I'll bring up this one. I think, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? Facebook's announcement of Meta. And then I kind of went into it and tried to understand what really is this concept of Meta? And then it is this whole virtual reality world that you're building per se. Now, no one knows what that's going to be, right? But that has a potential to kind of change how we kind of work, how we kind of interact with others, how our world, our reality is. We're literally going to have two realities. Right now, we can say that there is real world. I'm just looking at the screen, but that kind of creates this disjointment of there is a virtual reality and there is reality. So how far into the future should an organization kind of project itself to prepare itself, and how much investment do you have, like this number or kind of like how far into the future kind of thing that you can kind of share with us?
Not a number. I do a lot of work with strategy consulting firms, finding them digital DNA leaders and people to advise their clients, and we work with innovation, sort of, venturing as a service, product as a service. And I think what you've got is two contexts. If you're a mature organization, you can't just be looking at 10 years into the future all the time, because we've got big realities to deal with right here and now. So the way it's been described to me quite effectively is that you sort of got the super tanker of transformation, which is how you do gradual improvement and change with the assets and realities and organizational constructs and stakeholders and talent that you have. And then you've got this speedboat next to the super tanker, which is innovation. Now you've sort of got to let that get out in front of the super tanker a little bit, not get too far out of sight that it doesn't make any sense to the stakeholders or the board, or it's not meaningful anymore. But also you can't dump all your cargo onto it and sink it, right? So your legacy platforms, ways of doing things, but it's got to exist. So I think you've got to run a very future forward part of your business. And then you've got to have a program which is really empathetic to where your business is now. And then you've got to build meaningful connection between those two ways of thinking and working. But there's no certainty on the number, because every organization is kind of different. It might be really legacy, or it might be really future forward already. It might be really agile. I think we're seeing a lot of large or mature organizations adopting things like squads and tribes and agile ways of working, full stack software engineers instead of separate testing, all those types of things, different cultural attributes they're taking from fast moving venture world and adopting or adapting into more traditional corporates. Some of that works, some of it doesn't, but you've definitely got to be ready for change.
Right. And the story of Kodak comes to my mind when you said that, because it's like, and also exactly what you mentioned about the skills which are everlasting as well, like the communication, the flexibility, and your ability to kind of clearly kind of mention what the direction is. Because that speedboat, like the Kodak story, is that was the speedboat. The speedboat was the digital camera, but that was the super tanker, which was the chemicals business that they had. And I think what broke there was that linkage between the two, because when those on the speedboat came back and said that, look, we've got that island coming up right over there, that's where we should go, that's where the best stuff is going to be, the super tanker or whomever in the super tanker said, like, what for? It didn't make sense to them. And I think that's where the break happens.
It's not broken. What we're doing here still makes money. It's massive at scale, and that's the thing you sort of see. If it's not of a scale, a number that's meaningful to the board or the C-suite of an organization, it tends to be, and we've seen this with corporate venturing, probably horizon 1 or 2. We'll put $50 million or $100 million in a fund, and we'll go and spread bet like we'll be a VC, like Andreessen. And it's like, they're nowhere near the scale they need to be, either to get a result on a fund model, or to be anything more really than PR, that's saying that they're doing something innovative. I think that we've learned through a lot of those phases in many industries and locations, and we're coming out the other end, which is really exciting, which is probably larger scale investments, more a PE model for some companies, partnerships, acquisitions, M&A, and having a digital transformation and an innovation program. It's more a hybrid thing, which is finding the balance for that industry or that context. But it's very exciting at the same time.
Right. So we're kind of touching on that a little bit, and I think we're coming near to end, and we've got one more question here, which I'll come to in a short bit, but culture change. So I think culture change is another thing as well. And I think, again, in this day and age, in this world, it required a culture change for us to kind of work from home with our devices per se, and organizations adopting actually now changing your pays and benefits from the typical ones which you have towards actually what pays and benefits will help you at home, and even devices, how you use devices as well. Like I come from the work era where if I'm at work and I pick up my phone and I'm looking at my phone, someone is going to be looking at me and someone's going to be staring at me, or my boss is going to be staring at me like, what are you doing on your phone when you should be working right now? I think the example of Walmart it comes to mind as well, where managers historically are reluctant to have their employees hold handphones in their hands. But when things kind of changed, and when education or learning or mobility of work started changing, where you can use your devices to increase the productivity of that, then they started kind of changing their minds around it. So this is happening. But I guess the question is this. So apart from cultural change, what else can HR do to create effective digital learning environments for the employees? Or not just HR, I say, an organization. What approach or what can they do to kind of create this human digital centric environment for themselves?
Yeah, I think if you take any learning from technology industry itself, it's probably test and learn. So I think it's going to be different for every organization at some level, and some technologies or ways of working using tech and platforms will be really effective at a much larger scale than others. But it's kind of just testing it at a level that you can understand, and then take something that's real to the rest of the company, to both management and it's interesting. Most of these things, people make grand assumptions, and in that case, Walmart, this will be bad. If we allow this to happen. But then when you allow it to happen to an extent, someone goes, actually, it worked out really well. We got all this great engagement through, we could drive our applications for business continuity or efficacy or data extraction, whatever it might be, through this engagement point, which people are really comfortable with. They're not going to sit on Facebook all day.
Right.
So, it's they haven't got time. They've got to be productive, but it's finding the right balance for each organization, I think, means that you should be experimenting and looking to evolve what you're doing now all the time.
Right. And just to pick on that a little bit, I think this whole agile mindset, I think, comes into application. Yeah. I think the problem is most organizations are thinking of it as, look, if there's a change, I got to change everything. That's not necessarily the case. The case is you've got to pick where change is going to happen and understand what happens when you change that little bit over there. So pick a small group or pick a team which you can experiment that change. If, let's say, you're going to adopt a more digital style, continuous on-demand learning, apply with that small group, see what happens there, understand the kind of difficulties that happen there, and take the wins. Now redeploy that at a larger scale, and you're going to discover some new things at a larger scale as well, because it's now going to be more individuals, more different minds, more different departments coming into play, and then go bigger. And at some point you'll reach that mass adoption, and you're like, okay, let's go organization wide with this.
Well, if you can make it more viral, and it means that there's less energy that goes into actually asking everyone to change their behaviors at once. It should be hopefully more organic than that. I think historically, when enterprises have gone and implemented technology, it's like, well, we'll spend 6 or 12 months doing a discovery of having BAs everywhere, or a consulting group come in and figure out what we need, and then we'll do a parade of suppliers, and then it'll come down to cost, and you have most of the functions we need, we'll roll it out, but haven't really tested how the organization itself is going to react to that. And I think people are probably starting to get a little bit cautious around making monolithic investments in monolithic tech stacks that are inflexible. I think they're comfortable doing that, as you say, where there's integration or interoperability with an ecosystem, or where they can, they're not going to be locked in or trapped in an environment and then not get the utility they need. I think people are cautious of doing those things now, so they want to see that flexibility and ability to generate data and insights, and to be able to add and modular way sort of adapt to their own requirements.
And I think I've recently worked, I can't name the client, but I recently worked with a client, which I kind of saw that happen, because the story of IT departments in larger companies usually get blamed for being slow, but because they've got to handle a lot of things, they've got to handle an entire organization worth of IT requirements. But I started seeing one of these large companies, what they started doing was, okay, since IT needs to do these things, and if you want to implement a big project, then you go to IT. But if you want to do something small, we're going to empower each one of those departments to go and do it themselves. We let you do the test and learn. Exactly. Test and learn yourself.
Yeah.
Understand the pain points that are there. And then when you feel it's right, when you feel there is worth, bring it to the entire IT department. And then what the IT does is goes through the rigor that is required, because there could be security, there could be all these things that they need to consider before implementing it. So that test and learn phase gets removed away from the IT department itself and goes to the individual need departments itself. So I think that's a nice practice, actually, kind of going back to your test and learn thing.
It probably reflects what's happening between organizations and customers, right? So if we applied the same sort of CX principles and test and learn and insights on the inside of an organization as we do the outside. In HR, I talk about this a lot. We've worked with large companies that have, behavioral economics and CX and UX experts in the hundreds. But the experience of applying to that organization for a job is pretty terrible. And it's not a great experience. You think, well, what if you invested in that experience in the same way you do your customers? Would that give you better outcomes for your employer brand in market, for your ability to sort of retain people or attract people or get people through a process more effectively? And I think there's a lot of attention on that at the moment, because the environment that we're currently in is probably as difficult in a supply and demand sense at every level of technology and digital and new business and venturing and growth and change. It's hyper competitive. So the businesses we're seeing now, there's a lot of chief people officer roles out there in the market, and they're hard to fill. People want muscle memory around growth and change. And it's a lot of what they're talking about is not just TA or ability to get people in the door. It's about the experience, like candidate experience, employee experience, employee development, employee engagement. All of these things that impact on your ability to keep that talent and grow that talent, support it into leadership or other parts of the business. So it's a very interesting time.
Indeed. And speaking of time, I think I just got the alert that we've got 5 more minutes left. So let's pick up probably 2 quick questions and see if they kind of, if we can ask these questions. Let's see. Okay, we got a question from Esther here. And her question is this: how can organizations like HR build workforce skills at scale to thrive in this business world?
At scale, that's the thing. After you test and learn, then what do you do, right? I think then you've got to use systems and technology. I think that's where technology has a great role to play, is to how can you amplify success or the truths or the values and things? How can you help maintain communications and engagement and culture and all those things? You've got to leverage mass communications tools and data and all those things to support what is a very human endeavor. But I think that's a part of it, and then it's about always, I think, being purpose driven, like having a true north to hang things on, values. You talk about what happens when you scale something. Is it typically, we find that an organization gets to a point where the process hijacks the purpose, right? Then you're managing the lowest common denominator because of perceived risk. Because we've just got to make sure everyone's seeing this one thing every day. This never happens in the business. But fundamentally, people don't join an organization because of its processes. They join it because of its purpose. So, and they stay because of its purpose. So I think making sure that you don't implement technology systems or strategies that are devoid of the human element, which drives connection to your values and your purposes as an organization, and being able to, maintain that connection is really important.
All right. Okay, so we're kind of running out of time at this moment. We've got one question here from Delphine, which actually I'm going to say, Delphine, we kind of did answer this question. Her question was, how is AI transforming the hiring process? How much shall HR trust AI to do and carry out this task? So we kind of did answer, Jon did answer it, or we answered it during our conversation just now. So Delphine, go watch the whole thing again so that you can learn from what we kind of said. So Jon, before we kind of sign off, there's some space for you. Anything you want to shout out about what's coming up with you or what's coming up with MitchelLake that our listeners can be aware of, that they can engage with you on? Anything you want to shout out?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we're actually the research projects we did during COVID were actually to drive engagement, understanding with our sort of customers and candidates and the ecosystems across different geographies. And we produced some interesting research from that, which I'll share a link down in the chat so people can jump on that if they're interested. We're also going to bring out our effectively our own podcast series, Origin Stories of Talent Without Borders, sort of going more into the personalities, the executives and entrepreneurs that we've dealt with, over the last 20 years, some have become quite significant disruptors and innovators and leaders of change in different geographies. So we'll be bringing more of that content out. Hopefully it's meaningful to this conversation. So it's connected to this and useful, and reach out to us if you want to talk about any of those themes.
All right. All right. So Jon has dropped the link in the chat. We're going to share it across all the other platforms as well. I'm also going to say, go check out Jon's LinkedIn. Find him on LinkedIn and Jon Tanner or MitchelLake itself. I found some really nice stuff over there. So go check those things out. And to all our listeners here today, thank you so much for listening to the show. I think there was a lot of great harnessing, especially. And what we really wanted to do with this is give you perspective, thoughts on how, especially when you're going to move into 2022, the future is always going to move forward, but how can you frame things that you can do right now for your organization, especially to get itself ready so that you will be able to meet all your objectives for 2022. So thank you so much, Jon. Thank you to all our listeners. Thank you for joining us in this special week that is brought to you by Necole. And I got to do a plug as well for those of y'all who on the learning and development side, especially since we've been talking about more purpose-driven intentionality behind putting systems in, integrating systems in. If you want to find out how we can service that, how we can give you the right tools for the right moments, go on to Necole.tech, just fill in a form. Our team will contact you and we'll see how we can work together. So thank you everybody for joining the show. Take care. Have a wonderful afternoon on this Wednesday hump day and for the rest of the week. Take care, everybody. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.